At the 80th National Debate Tournament Final Round, California State University Long Beach, debating on the affirmative, faced off against Emory University on the negative. The official resolution for the year centered on collective bargaining and labor law. However, the substance of that topic was almost immediately set aside in favor of a debate over the function of the judge's ballot itself. CSU Long Beach demanded the ballot serve as an ethical referendum. They framed their performance as a spiritual intervention, arguing an affirmative vote was necessary to challenge the anti-blackness they identified within debate norms. Emory University took a different approach, defending the technical evaluation of arguments and arguing that the outcome of a competitive round should not be used to validate the truth of a critical theory. This flowsheet tracks the round, ending in a 3-2 decision crowning Emory national champions. This one-judge margin reveals the tension between performative framing and technical mechanics. Emory secured the title using procedural defenses to neutralize the affirmative's ethical claims. To understand how this happened, we have to look at how critical theory is operationalized as a win condition on the line-by-line. CSU Long Beach began the first affirmative speech by framing the labor topic as a racial contract. They argued that the community's focus on collective bargaining generated psychological wages for non-black participants, while excluding black life from the conversation. Their primary lens was the libidinal economy. This framework suggests that psychological investments and human desires are inseparable from economic ones, meaning that in the United States, labor and power are organized around anti-blackness. This strategy linked the libidinal economy to a rejection of the topic, which established their proposed role of the ballot. CSU delivered this role of the ballot as a prayer, closing with a call and response, and demanding that voting affirmative was the only way to affirm black nihilism as a spiritual insurgency. This effectively meant that a negative ballot would function as an endorsement of debate as usual and a replication of the very systems the affirmative was critiquing. This strategy forced the negative into a difficult position. If they engaged the topic through standard competitive norms, they would appear to confirm the affirmative's claim of structural violence. By making the round a spiritual evaluation, CSU attempted to remove procedural fairness and predictability from the judge's list of valid considerations. Emory responded by refusing to meet the affirmative on these ethical terms. Instead, they used 3 different structural arguments to bypass the affirmative's framing. In the first negative constructive, Emory launched a 3-pronged counterattack against the AF's structural claims. The first prong was topicality. Emory argued that the affirmative's failure to defend the legal resolution was an independent reason to vote negative, as it prevented the clash necessary for a fair debate. The second prong was a critique of psychoanalysis. Emory argued that diagnosing anti-blackness through a rigid libidinal economy actually made violence seem permanent and unchangeable, which short-circuited political action. Emory replaced the affirmative's framework with the singular, a model where desire is spontaneous and fluid, rather than governed by an immutable unconscious structure. The third element of the negative strategy was an argument based on the art of failure. Emory argued that by insisting on winning a debate tournament to validate their critical method, the affirmative was actually reinforcing the exact same traditional norms of mastery and exceptionalism they claimed to oppose. This turned the affirmative's desire for the ballot into a liability. Emory argued that losing the round could be a more productive, counter-hegemonic act than winning. In the late rebuttals, the debate shifted. CSU moved away from a direct defense of their case to focus on an ethical indictment of Emory's technical strategy. They introduced the impact of spirit murder, claiming that Emory's use of multiple procedural arguments actively harmed the spiritual and mental health of the debaters. The affirmative centered this claim on conditionality. This rule allows the negative to introduce several arguments and then discard them later in the round. CSU argued that by doing this, Emory treated black insurgency as a disposable tool used only to secure a competitive win. To prove this, CSU highlighted how Emory's justifications for using multiple arguments changed between the cross-examination and the later speeches. CSU argued that this theoretical abuse was so severe it should outweigh topicality and all of the negative's other arguments. This repositioned a standard debate rule as the primary measure of whether the negative was engaging in anti-black violence, demanding the judges reject Emory's entire performance. In the final negative speech, Emory's Daniel Gallagher refused to let the round turn purely into a referendum on their use of conditionality. Gallagher diffused the link by committing to every single argument Emory had made from the beginning of the round. By refusing to discard his earlier critiques, he argued that the negative was not treating the affirmative's position as fungible. This maneuver created what debate terminology calls a performative double turn. Emory argued it was a logical contradiction for CSU to spend 90 minutes critiquing anti-black violence, only to ask the judge to decide the national championship on a technical rule about kicking arguments. Emory then used the Carroll evidence to turn the affirmative strategy against itself. This argument, known as cruel optimism, suggests that CSU's demand for the judge to feel uncomfortable creates a parasitic dependency, where the debaters rely on the critic to validate their psychological state. Emory also noted that while the affirmative claimed that psychoanalyzing people without consent was a form of violence, they had spent the round doing exactly that to the judges and their opponents. This forced the panel to evaluate the ethics of the affirmative's actual behavior in the round, rather than the theoretical merits of their prayer. By the time the final speech ended, the 5 judges faced 2 completely different ways of viewing the round. The panel split their decision 3-2. 2 judges focused on the affirmative's claims, agreeing that spirit murder was the most important impact, and that Emory's technical maneuvers were proof of it. These 2 judges accepted the framing that the ballot is primarily an ethical intervention, concluding that the negative shifting strategy was a violation that outweighed the rest of the flow. The other 3 judges voted negative, citing the art of failure, topicality, and the alternative provided by the psychoanalysis critique. These 3 judges were persuaded that the affirmative's framework, asking for a win to validate their existence, was more strategically and ethically flawed than Emory's use of conditional advocacy. Emory's negative strategy provides a blueprint for how technical arguments can be used to answer performative affirmatives. It is often assumed that a vote-aff performance captures the ethical high ground, leaving no room for a procedural response. However, in this round, the majority of the panel found that the affirmative's demand for the ballot was a more significant vulnerability than the negative's failure to debate the topic. By using the art of failure, Emory was able to turn the affirmative's moral framing against them, making their competitive drive part of the problem. The 80th NDT final round suggests that when critical theory meets technical debate, the outcome often depends on which team manages the specifics of the flow more effectively.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're bringing you directly into this incredibly intense, high-stakes collision of ideas.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, we are unpacking the final round of the 80th National Debate Tournament, and we're using a detailed transcript that basically reconstructs the rapid-fire arguments of this championship policy debate.
Right, which is just a fascinating document to go through.
Totally. So on one side, we have CSU Long Beach taking the affirmative, and on the other side, Emory University taking the negative. Our mission today is to explore a profound clash of paradigms. We're really contrasting the affirmative's, what they call spiritual insurgency, against the negative's strict reliance on topicality and, the established rules of the game.
It is such a remarkable situation to analyze because, for 8 months, these college students have been meticulously debating U.S. labor rights and collective bargaining.
Right.
That was the official topic assigned for the entire season. Like, every team in the country was preparing policy proposals and counter-proposals based entirely on labor law.
Just standard, rigid debate stuff.
Exactly. But then, when they reached the final round, the ultimate championship, the debate completely transformed and morphed into this high-level philosophical battle over race, psychology, the meaning of winning, and honestly, whether the rulebook of debate itself is inherently violent.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. Now, just a quick note for you, the listener, before we really get into the weeds here. Because we are diving into incredibly complex, politically charged arguments about race, society, and institutions, we just want to be clear right up front.
Yeah, definitely.
As your guides on this deep dive, we aren't taking sides or endorsing either of these viewpoints. We're acting entirely as neutral observers. Our goal is just to help you understand the sophisticated, frankly, mind-bending arguments presented by both of these championship teams.
Precisely. We are analyzing the mechanics of their strategies. We want to understand not just what they argued, but how and why those arguments function in the space.
Right. So to understand why a championship team would suddenly just throw out the rule book, we have to look at CSU Long Beach's overarching strategy, which is their spiritual insurgency.
Yes.
In a traditional policy debate, the affirmative team is required to propose a specific policy plan. But CSU Long Beach walked into that final round and basically declared that after 8 months of debating collective bargaining, the topic itself had become this comfort zone.
Right, a comfort zone that they argued only reproduced what they called white nihilism.
Exactly.
They essentially argued that the traditional debate format forces participants to rely on a value system rooted in European humanism.
Which, we should probably unpack that term a bit.
Yeah, we should. So European humanism, which heavily originated during the Enlightenment, championed these big ideas of universal human rights, liberty, and rationalism. But CSU Long Beach argued that historically, these universal rights were constructed by specifically excluding black people to define what human even meant.
Wow. So, to use an analogy, it's kind of like trying to remodel a house while ignoring the fact that the foundation itself is completely rotten.
That's a great way to put it.
CSU argued that concepts like labor and power don't just exist in a vacuum. They only actually make coherent sense in a society built on a foundation of anti-blackness. And they drove this home by introducing the concepts of the libidinal economy and psychological wages.
Right, and this is a really profound philosophical claim. The libidinal economy theory argues that racism isn't just a byproduct of capitalism, or some tool used by the elite to divide the working class.
Right, like standard Marxist theory.
Exactly. Instead, they say racism is a fundamental driving psychological force. The affirmative argue that non-black workers reap psychological wages from anti-blackness.
Meaning there's a double incentive to exploit black people. Like there's obviously the economic benefit of cheap or forced labor, sure, but there's also a psychic benefit.
Yeah, a deeply psychological one.
Right. It's this deep-seated need to maintain a master-slave narrative just to preserve a sense of societal superiority. CSU is basically arguing that standard liberal inclusion, like just granting collective bargaining rights, just pulls black people away from genuine insurgent organization and forces them to participate in a system that feeds this horrific dynamic.
Exactly. And because they believed the system itself was structurally compromised in that way, they felt they couldn't just deliver a standard policy speech.
Because that would be playing the game.
Exactly. That would be participating in the system. So they completely revolutionized the method of their first affirmative constructive, commonly known in debate as the 1AC.
Right.
It wasn't a proposal at all. It was actually delivered as a prayer.
Wait, like a literal prayer?
Yes. It was this intense rhythmic litany punctuated by the repeated phrase, expletive. Yeah, they systematically listed out all the traditional debate norms, the framework, the concept of fairness, judging procedures, the very idea that debaters should have to switch sides and argue against their own beliefs. And they just rejected all of it.
They just threw it all out.
Completely. They called these norms a racial contract that forces black debaters to justify their very existence just to earn a judge's ballot. They even incorporated a call and response element, literally asking the room, can I get an amen?
That is wild. I mean, think of it like sitting down to play a complex board game, but before the first move, your opponent looks at you and says, you know, the rules of this game were written specifically to erase my identity.
Exactly.
Like the only way I can actually win is to refuse to roll the dice, throw the rule book out the window, and ask you to validate my existence instead.
Yeah.
Suddenly, that comforting predictability of just moving pieces around a board is completely gone.
And that analogy perfectly captures the stakes they set in the round. CSU framed voting affirmative as an endorsement of black vitality. It was this invitation for the judges to think insurgently and reject the racial contract. Conversely, they framed voting negative as endorsing debate as usual, which they explicitly characterize as committing spirit murder.
Spirit murder. I mean, that is an incredibly heavy accusation to level in a debate round. If you force me to play by these rules, you are actively participating in my erasure.
Yeah, it's immense.
Which really puts the negative team, Emory University, in a monumental strategic bind. If you're Emory, and your opponent claims the very act of following the rules is a form of violence, you can't just stand up and say, well, rules are rules.
No, absolutely not.
That just makes you sound like a total oppressor.
Precisely. Emory realized they had to prove why the rules actually matter. They had to demonstrate that the rules of debate possess an intrinsic value that actually supersedes or, answers the affirmative's claims.
And that brings us to the negative strict reliance on topicality, which is a debate term, right?
Yes. Emory's first negative constructive, the 1NC, comes out swinging by demanding that the affirmative defend the actual assigned topic. The resolution for the year was literally that the U.S. federal government should strengthen collective bargaining rights.
Right, the labor topic.
Right, so Emory pulled out dictionaries and legal definitions for words like resolved and should, basically demanding mandatory legal action from the affirmative.
But, I mean, Emory didn't frame this as just a mere administrative complaint, did they?
No, not at all. They elevated topicality into a moral imperative. Emory argued that predictability is the foundational prerequisite for in-depth clash and argument refinement.
Okay.
Like, without a predictable shared topic, the negative team has no ability to research in advance, and if they can't research, the debate just collapses into a one-sided monologue, and the whole educational value of the activity is destroyed.
So Emory is essentially saying, fairness isn't just a referee's tool, it's a moral virtue. They argued that you can't have a meaningful insurgency if you destroy the only arena we have to actually test and refine those revolutionary ideas.
That's the absolute core of their defense. And the transcript highlights a really fascinating moment where this theoretical clash meets practical strategy. It happens during cross-examination, the rapid-fire questioning period.
Oh, this part was brilliant.
Yeah.
Let me break down the mechanics of this for you, because it's a masterclass in logical traps. CSU had claimed in their speech that debating the labor topic promised to teach democracy, but in reality, it taught the debate community absolutely nothing.
Right, they said it was useless.
So Emory presses them on this, and they focus on a debate concept called fiat. Now, for the listener, in debate, fiat is a rule where everyone just pretends a proposed plan magically passes Congress.
Yeah, it's like a magic wand.
Exactly. So the debaters can focus purely on whether the idea is good or bad, rather than wasting time arguing about political gridlock.
Right, it's just a necessary shortcut for policy debate to function. But Emory forces CSU to admit that relying on fiat inherently skips the essential real-world step of actually going to Congress, rallying a base, and, organizing a labor movement.
And when CSU admits that on the record, Emory pulls off what debaters call a straight turn.
Yeah, it's so clever.
Emory basically says, aha. The fact that we discovered fiat skips real-world organizing proves that debating the topic does have educational value. Like, it exposes the exact gaps in organizing you were complaining about.
It is a devastatingly elegant maneuver. CSU set the condition that the topic taught nothing, and Emory just used the mechanics of debate itself to prove that discovering its limitations is, in fact, an education.
Wow. But, I have to push back here a little bit, or at least look at this from CSU's perspective.
Sure.
Emory's making a great logical point, sure. But aren't they just walking right into CSU's trap? CSU just spent their whole speech saying caring about procedure and fairness is the definition of white comfortability.
Right, yeah.
And Emory's response is basically, but we really, really like procedure and fairness. I mean, aren't they just proving CSU's point? By defending the rules so rigidly, aren't they just playing the role of the quintessential moderate who prefers order over justice?
You've hit on the exact reason why Emory couldn't only rely on topicality.
Oh, right.
Because if Emory had stopped there, they very likely would have lost. Just defending the rules risks proving the affirmative's point that the system is rigid and exclusionary.
Right.
So Emory recognized that to win, they had to dismantle the affirmative spiritual insurgency from the inside out. They had to go on the offensive. They had to attack the psychological foundation of CSU's actual argument.
And that brings us to the deep clashes of the round. Emory launched two powerful critiques, or critiques as they're spelled with a K in debate, targeting the affirmative's underlying philosophy.
Right.
First, they went straight after the libidinal economy, the psychoanalysis critique.
Yes. Emory challenged the affirmative's foundational premise that anti-blackness is a fixed, unconscious psychological drive. Emory argued that relying on psychoanalysis to explain racism is actually really dangerous and depoliticizing because it ontologizes anti-blackness.
Okay, let's unpack that word, ontologizes.
Yeah.
Because Emory is basically saying that CSU is making anti-blackness a fundamental, inescapable property of reality.
Right, like a law of physics.
Like gravity.
Yeah.
If racism is just an unavoidable subconscious psychological drive locked in human nature, then how can we ever fight it? I mean, you can't legislate away gravity.
Exactly. And the consequence of that framing is what Emory really focused on. If you believe racism is an inescapable drive, it breeds political paralysis. Emory argued this framing actually locks in neoliberalism. You know, this is a system of free market capitalism that often exacerbates inequality.
Right, because if you convince people that deep structural racism is unfixable due to human psychology,
then you essentially give society a free pass to just abandon collective policy solutions.
you just throw your hands up and say, well, humans are inherently racist, so let's just let the free market run.
Exactly.
That is a fascinating counterpunch. Emory is telling the judges, CSU's theory of racism actually makes racism impossible to defeat. So, what was Emory's alternative to this?
Well, Emory proposed endorsing what they called the singular. This is a philosophical shift toward viewing desire and identity as spontaneous, generative, and malleable, rather than governed by some rigid, inescapable, unconscious structure.
Okay, that makes sense.
They argued we need to challenge the authority of the unconscious if we ever want to build real, effective political coalitions capable of, actually changing the material conditions of marginalized people.
And as if dismantling the psychology wasn't enough, Emory brought out a second critique called the art of failure.
Yeah, this one is intense.
When I was reading this part of the transcript, the contradiction Emory points out just leapt off the page. CSU is claiming the system is spiritually murderous, right? Mm-hmm. But they are fighting tooth and nail to win a shiny plastic trophy from that exact same system. Emory argues that CSU is tying the validity of black living to competitive success in a debate tournament.
It is a totally devastating observation. Emory argues this is disastrous because of its logical implications. Like, if winning the national debate tournament is what validates your method and proves your existence, what does that imply about all the debaters who didn't reach the final?
I mean, it inherently implies they are failures.
Precisely. Emory argues this compounds disenfranchisement and intensifies a toxic form of American exceptionalism, where your personal value is directly tied to a win-loss record.
Wow.
So the art of failure critique proposes rejecting this obsession with mastery, domination, and winning. Emory argued that tying your self-worth and the validity of an insurgent movement to a judge's ballot in a competitive game is the ultimate trap of the very system CSU claims to be fighting.
Man, so we have an incredible standoff here. CSU claims Emory is causing spirit murder by violently enforcing the rules of the game. Emory counters that CSU is causing harm by adopting a paralyzing psychology and tying their self-worth to the game's trophy.
Yep, they're just going blow for blow.
How on earth did CSU respond to this barrage in their rebuttals?
Well, CSU launched a furious counterattack, and they centered their defense on a strategic concept called conditionality.
Okay, let me explain conditionality real quick for you, because it's a crucial concept here. In debate, conditionality means the negative team can argue multiple entirely contradictory things at the same time just to see what sticks and wins them the ballot.
Right.
It's like a lawyer in a murder trial arguing first that their client wasn't even in the state when the crime happened, and second that, well, if he was there, it was self-defense.
Exactly.
It's logically inconsistent, but strategically advantageous. So CSU is saying Emory's just throwing arguments at the wall.
Yes, and CSU weaponized this concept against Emory. They pointed out the hypocrisy. I mean, Emory argued passionately that the rules of debate must be strictly followed for fairness, but simultaneously brought in complex critiques about the art of failure and psychoanalytic theories that also drift away from traditional policy debate.
Right.
So CSU argued this proves Emory treats black insurgency as fungible.
Fungible, like a commodity or a currency they can just, trade away or swap out when it's convenient for them.
Precisely. CSU argued Emory wasn't actually engaging with the deep pain of their prayer. Emory was just tossing these profound issues of identity aside for the love of the game. CSU's final speech is hammered on what they called Emory's unethical relationality.
Unethical relationality. And CSU claimed that if the judges voted for Emory's conditional strategy, it would cause anti-black extinction in the debate space.
Yeah, which is a massive claim.
Right. And on the surface, extinction sounds hyperbolic.
Okay.
But let's connect the micro to the macro here. CSU is essentially arguing that if a debate judge rewards Emory for using black identity as just another disposable chess piece to win a round, it sets a terrifying precedent.
Exactly.
It signals to every future black debater that their lived experience is only valuable as a strategic commodity to be manipulated by their opponents. That is the extinction they're warning about. The complete erasure of authentic identity and safety in the debate space.
It's a really powerful argument about precedent. CSU is saying the fact that you are using multiple contradictory strategies to try and beat our prayer proves that you don't actually care about the substance of our lives. You only care about winning the ballot.
Right.
And that, CSU argues, is the ultimate spirit murder. It precludes marginalized debaters from even wanting to enter the institution.
So put yourself in the judge's shoes for a second. The tension in that room must have been absolutely suffocating. You are one of 5 judges. You have to weigh the intrinsic structural value of fairness and clash against this incredibly heavy, deeply personal accusation of spirit murder and systemic erasure.
It's almost impossible.
What stands out to you as the deciding factor?
It is a monumentally difficult decision, requiring them to balance procedural integrity against profound ethical claims. And, the panel was split. It was a 3-2 decision.
A single ballot decided the national championship. Who won?
Emory University. The negative won the 80th National Debate Tournament.
Okay, we need to break down the rationale of those judges. How do they navigate this intellectual minefield?
Well, let's look at the split. 2 judges fully bought the affirmative's argument. They voted for CSU Long Beach, agreeing that the affirmative's framing of spirit murder and the necessity of using the ballot to validate their existence outweighed Emory's defense of the rules and conditionality.
So for those 2, the ethical imperative to endorse the insurgency came first. The rules were secondary to the human element.
Exactly. But 3 judges went the other way, handing the championship to Emory.
Why did they side with the rules?
The 3 winning judges felt that the affirmative's framing was actually more damaging to insurgent movements than Emory's procedural tactics.
Wait, really? That's a fascinating twist. How did they arrive at that conclusion?
It comes back to the institution they were critiquing. The judges were deeply persuaded by Emory's art of failure argument. They realized that treating a debate ballot as the ultimate referendum on black validity and making a panel of academic debate judges the ultimate arbiters of that validity was a very dangerous trap.
Right.
It created an unhealthy dependency on the very institution CSU was claiming to fight.
Ah, I see. The judges felt that CSU was actively undercutting their own insurgency. Like, you can't credibly claim an institution is fundamentally violent, but then demand that the exact same institution validate your existence by handing you a championship trophy.
Exactly. Furthermore, Emory's psychoanalysis critique successfully controlled the philosophical narrative. Emory convinced the judges that blaming racism on a fixed libidinal economy makes the problem impossible to solve and breeds political apathy.
Wow.
Yeah, and combined with Emory's defense of topicality as a necessary space for equitable clash, the judges felt Emory's vision was ultimately better for the community. A predictable topic allows both sides to prepare, research, and test ideas rigorously.
So the judges decided that this framework was a better vehicle for education and equity than CSU's total rejection of the rules.
Right.
So Emory basically successfully threaded the needle. I mean, they didn't dismiss the affirmative's pain or the reality of anti-blackness. Instead, they critiqued the affirmative solution.
Exactly.
They proved that throwing out the rules and adopting a paralyzing psychoanalytic framework would actually make the world worse for the very people the affirmative was trying to help. They proved why the rules mattered. That rules are necessary to prevent the debate from collapsing into a contest of who can claim the most victimization without any predictable, equitable way to test those claims.
It was a masterful defensive procedure, not just for the sake of order, but for the sake of productive, clash-driven education.
This has been such an incredible exploration. Just to summarize the massive tension of this deep dive. CSU Long Beach tried to break the system to save the debater. They argued that the rules themselves were a racial contract that required them to check their identity at the door. And on the flip side, Emory defended the system to save the debate.
Yeah.
They argued that without shared rules, predictability, and fairness, there is no debate. There is only a monologue. And tying your self-worth to winning that monologue is a recipe for despair.
It's a clash that echoes far beyond the walls of a college debate tournament, It asks us to fundamentally consider how we function in society, how we navigate imperfect institutions, and really the limits of our political frameworks.
Exactly. Do institutions inherently erase those on the margins? And if they do, is the most effective answer to tear down the rules or to use the rules to rigorously reform the system? It brings us right back to the paradox of that board game we discussed earlier.
A paradox that remains deeply relevant today.
It really does.
Yeah.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on the incredible tension we've unpacked today. Think about this. If the ultimate act of insurgency is to refuse the rules of the game, what happens when that refusal becomes your specific, calculated strategy to win the championship? Can any established institution, whether it's a debate tournament, a prestigious university, or a federal government, ever truly, authentically evaluate a critique of its own existence? Or does the very act of declaring a winner, of handing out a trophy and a title, immediately pull the insurgent right back into the system they were desperately trying to escape? Does winning the game mean you ultimately submitted to it?
It's a huge question.
It's a heavy question, and one that certainly doesn't have an easy answer. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the 80th National Debate Tournament. We hope this exploration gave you a lot to think about. Until next time, keep questioning the rules of the game.